Hello everybody, welcome to Angry Harry's MRA Corner. Today I'm going to interview Dean Esmay, the managing editor of AVFM. Hello Dean.
Well, hello, Harry. Nice to see you it's Saturday morning for me. I guess it's Saturday afternoon for you.
Yeah, it's Saturday afternoon here in London and it is boiling hot. We're all suffering from a heat wave at the moment, having had lots of thunderstorms and rain last night. So a lot of sort of red faces around the place, people tired and they're fed up and what have you. We're up to about 80, I think. Okay, Dee, I came across you a few years ago, and I can't remember where. I think it was AVFM, but I'm not sure. And what I wanted to ask you, in particular, my first question to you is, I seem to remember you saying, or arguing at the time, that MRAs should refrain from attacking feminism. And now I know you've changed your opinion about that, but what I wanted to ask you is this. At that point in time, what made you think that we should avoid attacking feminism? Was it because it wasn't fair, or was it because did you think feminism wasn't really the main problem?
Well, at a deep level, I do think feminism is not the ultimate problem, but that's an exploration on its own, I think. But at the time, let's see. First off, I was still very impressed with the work of Christina Hoff Sommers, who calls herself an equity feminist. At one time, there had been what looked like it was going to be an influential group called the I feminists, who were sort of individualist feminists, who were saying perfectly sensible, reasonable things. You had self-proclaimed feminists like Kathy Young, who at least seemed to be striving to go in the right direction. So there was that.
Yes, they were. And there was Wendy McElroy, wasn't it? Wendy McElroy or somebody?
Not remembering that name off the top of my head, but I imagine if I saw something, I would. Anyway, they were there, and I had been influenced by their thinking. And at a deeper level, I knew and still did know any number of women, everyday, ordinary women, who weren't particularly hateful, hurtful people, who self-identified as feminists, but did not have any hateful views. What I think you and I might call a coffee shop feminist. Oh, I believe in equality and all that, and I didn't want to hurt their feelings. It just seemed better. Now we know that Dean has somewhat changed his tune. It seemed better to be challenging feminists to live up to their own stated ideals of equality. Oh, yes, feminism is about equality. Well, what are we going to do about this issue then, where men get the short of the end of the stick? But the problem is, it was people like John Hembling and Paul Elam who, not consciously, it's not like they personally worked on me, but I sat there and I watched their work, and I sat there and watched the results of their work, and I saw that they were upsetting people, which is what I predicted. But they were also bringing attention to these issues in a way that had never been effective before. I had done some work with Glenn Sachs. I had done some work with Jan Brown and her domestic abuse hotline for men and women, which is an American service that tries to help battered men as well as women. I had done some work with Save Services, which is a group out of Washington, D.C., and they all go out of their way not to offend feminists. And but the thing is they also, no disrespect for them, whatever the merits of their work, the situation was only getting worse and worse.
Yes, and the feminists weren't listening, were they? It was very difficult. I mean, they weren't listening to our complaints.
Yes. And there's an old saying that finally, I make no secret of the fact that I'm a recovering alcoholic. Been sober for some years now, but I remembered the experience. It came on me full force when I was reading A Voice for Men one day. Um, uh, there was this guy I used to see around tables, and we would often have trouble with people new coming in who would be constantly falling off the wagon, and they would be sitting there rationalizing, saying things like, "Well, I thought I could handle it, so I tried this, and so I thought I could handle it, so I tried that." And this one guy, he was snotty, but he was right. His standing question was, "And how's that working out for you so far?" To which the inevitable answer was, "It's not." And it just suddenly came to me full force, this trying to be nice and reasonable with these people who refuse to be nice and reasonable, or who agree that you might have a point, but then pat you on the head and do nothing. There's no reason to be nice to them. There really isn't. In fact, I gave it a shot for way too long, is what I eventually realized. I'd been at this for 10 some years trying to be nice and reasonable and polite. And also, one of my personal political heroes, and this is going back to the 80s, or at least the early 90s, comes from when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, whom I'm a big fan of. And I've long considered him one of my personal heroes. And Malcolm offended people all the time, and he didn't care. And it made a difference. And so, the short final analysis of it came to, oh, you're a feminist and you're not like that, except you're not doing anything about it. And you're not making things different. And in fact, in 20, 30 years of looking at these things, for the vast majority of them, they've either not changed or they've gotten worse. Fuck this. There's no reason to be nice about it anymore. And if I offend you, good, you need to be offended. You're doing something offensive.
Yes, which is what, if I may speak for Paul Elam, I mean, that's what he set out to do. With AVFM, his aim was to wind them up and annoy them and aggravate them. Because he realized too that, talking was getting absolutely nowhere, and all you got for your efforts were a lot of insults coming back, usually, ranging from the very fact that you're addressing feminism or questioning it suggested that either you were a misogynist, you had a small penis, your mother didn't breastfeed you. I mean, this is the kind of language, I mean, certainly on the internet, that always came in your way simply for making the mildest of criticisms of feminism.
Yes, and it went even deeper. I mean, I considered myself a feminist for once in a while, and then I would engage in discussions with feminism, and they would start talking about issues that they had faced, that had made their life difficult in some ways, which it's not like no feminist ever experienced a bad thing.
Yes.
But then I would try and share a similar experience of mine, and I would be mocked or told to shut up.
Yes.
And it's like, wait a minute. So really, I can't be in the feminist club. My job as a man is to sit down and shut up.
Yes.
And it just all came to me very full force. And I saw a couple of events transpire online, watching feminists beat up on, male and female feminists beat up on helpless people. And I said, screw this. Either you're one of these hateful feminists, or you're giving cover to these hateful feminists.
Yes. What I saw, which really antagonized me, and still to this day kind of hurts me, was on a forum, and it must have been about, 10 or 11 years ago, where there was some guy who was talking about committing suicide because he had lost access to his children, and he described an appalling situation that he was continually having with his wife and so on. And it was clearly he was clearly depressed and on the face of it suicidal. And so reading his stuff on this forum was very depressing. But what got to me were some of the comments coming in from some women, and basically they were calling him a loser. Things like, "You're a loser. No wonder she left you. You don't deserve. You're not a man." And I thought, how can you say this to this guy? You've never met him. You don't know what his situation is, and he's clearly anyway. So that's what that really wound me up to such an extent that whatever level of anger I had towards feminism in those days was multiplied tenfold after that particular incident. That's how nasty they can be. So And now we do attack feminism constantly on ABFM and all over the place. Is it enough? Is it enough, or should we be doing other things? I mean, do we have other problems?
Well, I do think confronting feminism is almost always worthwhile at this time. And that has to keep happening. Because either feminism has a road to Damascus moment and completely changes, or it needs to go away as the hate movement that it is. And so, but the one caveat I would give to that is never argue with a feminist one-on-one. Well, almost never. It's almost never worth your time. Almost. Once in a great while you might, but for the most part, it's almost never worth it. But if it's in a public forum where other people can keep going, can be watching, and you'd be shocked in online discourse. I know you like to write things and you leave comments. So do I. You and I have to realize, and anybody else who leaves comments or writes the occasional blog post has to realize that more than 95% of those who are on the internet never leave a comment on anything or respond to anything. They're just reading. My wife's one of those, but this has been true for years. Surveys have shown it. Most people aren't. So if you're writing things and you're arguing with a feminist, be sure it's in a public place. That's A. And then B, you need to make sure that if people are watching and wondering which the crazy one is, they're pretty sure it's not you.
Yeah. Let them hang themselves, in other words.
Yes, exactly. And so that is valuable if it's in public, because I believe our biggest mission at this point is cultural change and causing cognitive dissonance in these implicit and wrongful assumptions that feminism as an ideology has just seeped into the culture, that women are oppressed, uniquely oppressed, that men, if they are oppressed, it's almost by accident.
I would go further. Yes, I would say it's more than seeped. It hasn't just seeped into the culture, it's been hammered into the culture.
That's right. If you're under 40, yes, if you're under 40, you probably have never lived in a world where that just wasn't accepted as an axiomatic truth. Certainly if you're under 30.
And if the feminists sort of gave up the ghost and the women's studies departments disappeared and the feminist laws disappeared, would our problems be gone?
This is where I get into it with some of my fellow MRAs, because I give you a very staunch no to that.
Okay, can you tell me why? Why not?
Well, first off, maybe this is so clear to me because I grew up in a staunchly anti-feminist household. I did not grow up indoctrinated with feminism. Now, mind you, I'm older. I just turned 48 this week. But I grew up it's probably a little foreign to most Brits, but it was a little schizophrenic, but for the most part, let's call it a rock-ribbed fundamentalist Christian American experience. And in my view, within that very conservative upbringing, or what would be considered very conservative by today's standards, male disposability was just embedded in most of life's assumptions. It is absolutely a man's job to sacrifice himself for family, for country, for God, family, and country. It is absolutely a man's duty to sacrifice himself. If a woman is in peril, it is a man's job to rescue her. If a man is failing to properly provide for his family, he is not a man. If a man does not wish to serve in the military or go into combat, he is a coward and a shame to his family and his nation and everybody else. A man's job is to protect and provide for his wife, period. And if a man is not living up to his expectations, to the expectations of the women in his life, then he is truly not a man. And those were all embedded values. And now this doesn't mean I don't think a man should, if he can, be part of supporting his family. And it doesn't mean I don't think a man should never act to protect someone he loves. But the axiomatic assumption that this is what defines you as a man was there right from the get-go. And there was no such expectation on the women. None whatsoever. And this is why, actually, by the 1980s, when I began reading about feminism, it sounded very good. And I thought, well, I'm a feminist. So, I mean, I was never foolish enough to think men and women were entirely identical, but it was all music to my ears. We'll all have the same basic respect given to each other, the same basic accountability given to each other. There won't be any of these double standards. And it just, and the feminists who exhibited double standards were, well, they must have just been the exception, or something must have just gone wrong somewhere, like Christina Hoff Sommers, who said, who stole feminism and why? Well, we can just fix this. And so anyway, I think that for thousands of years, it has been necessary for men to do most of the brutal hard work of protecting and providing for practical, pragmatic reasons, but that for thousands of years, women had life tough too. And so, a cultural milieu developed of women first. This even meant that while there might be somewhat more restrictions on a woman's life, you even go back to Blackstone and others, they were all there because society was prioritizing the protection of women and meeting their needs, protection and provision for women. It's been there for centuries. And in fact, centuries upon centuries. And if you look at the early, what we might call the start of feminism in the 19th century, and even all the way through what's supposedly called the second wave, who were the suffragette women? Who were the early feminist women? Upper class white women who wanted the privileges of men, of the upper class white men. That's about all it ever was. And you even still see it very visibly today. Your most feminist women are almost always privileged women of privileged and privileged upbringing, who are primarily just complaining that they don't get all the goodies. But then when there's consequences to their own actions or their own choices, it's somebody else's fault, such as the patriarchy or whatnot. And that's not the feminism I signed up for. And as time has gone on and I've questioned more things, I've realized that's because the feminism I signed on for, if it ever existed, was always a minority.
It didn't exist in my view. I think it was all a con. I think you're right. It was a bunch of women who managed to get a lot of power in the last 100 years because they dominated the media and made a huge fuss about whatever they could make a fuss about, basically.
Yes, I'm afraid so, although men have an absolute share in the responsibility of that, which is another one we're going to have to face up to one of these days. Had enough men at some point said, all right, wait a minute, that's enough.
Yes. I think, if I can say so, I think one of the reasons, I didn't know what was going on because in those days, prior to the internet, all the information that came into my head was from the mainstream media. It didn't come in from anywhere else. And so, and I trusted, fool that I was, and I think most people were in the same position. I trusted the BBC, I trusted the Times newspaper. And even though, for example, I knew, as a youngster that, politicians would spin a bit here and spin a bit there, what I didn't know was how much bald-faced lying was going on all the time. The public was always being lied to by just about everyone in power. If not directly being told lies, being given only partial information so that my point is that we did not know what was going on. So, for example, if I would have heard something like, so many women are, I don't know, raped in college or something, and it was in the mainstream media, I would believe it. I mean, that's the way I was brought up, to sort of respect authority, to listen to those in government, to listen to police officers. And so I would believe these things, and I think most of the public did. And I think it's taken the internet to help people to realize that, hold on, we're being bamboozled, and have been for a very long time. So I don't blame the men from the past. I don't really blame men my age for not standing up to it, because we didn't know there was anything to stand up to. We just believed it.
Men of an older generation, to some extent, can't be blamed for just believing what they're told. I can see that. I've also talked to older women like Barbara Kay, Erin Pitsey, Ann Cools. These were people at the men's conference, and a few others of that generation who also, like when they were young, back in the 70s when this was all going on, were saying, nobody's ever going to take this seriously. It's just a fad and it's all going to pass. And never calculated that these people would take over the universities and would take over the news media, and now assumptions that, and eventually government, yes. And of course, they'll even laugh. I know one of your supposed men's advocates in the UK there, Ali Fogg, likes to scoff that Harriet Harman matters because David Cameron's Tories are in charge now. It's like, you stupid bloody fool. I'm sorry, he's a nice chap, but he's a fool, because these feminist women have infiltrated their way into the bureaucracies, the permanent bureaucracies, the unelected parts of government that don't change from government to government. And they're exerting huge, enormous power, spreading lies about domestic violence, lies about sexual assault, lies about fatherhood, and getting a great deal of power, and it's seeped in to a very deep level. So, I mean, I do have to say, even if feminism becomes a hated ideology, undoing everything that they've done will still be the work of a generation, at least. And we'll have this bedrock assumption to fight, which is, I don't know how much of it is instinctive and how much of it is cultural. I think it's a bit of both. But that men owe women something, just by dint of their being men and them being women.
And you think that'll remain the case, even if feminism is sent into oblivion?
Yes,
Right.
it shall,
Right.
unless we start questioning it.
Right.
And now, even to some extent, I'm not convinced we want to completely obliterate such urges, but I think we badly need young men to start saying that most brutal, ungentlemanly of all questions to women, either individually or collectively, when it comes to relationships, which is, what's in it for me?
Mm-hmm.
And if the answer is just sex, that's not good enough, Buttercup. Your vagina's not quite as valuable as all that.
Right.
Which is a crass thing to say, but it's true. What do women owe men in relationships? And if the answer is what it is now, which is essentially nothing, then there's no reason for men to participate in that.
Right. So what do you actually think will happen? I mean, if you were to sort of put a bet on not what you would like to happen, but what do you actually think will happen? I mean, or will it just get worse?
I see two general likelihoods, two paths that we can go down culturally and civilizationally. Path one is we continue the way we're going. And if we continue the way we're going to wind up looking a lot like Japan is looking culturally these days.
Which is what?
We have,
Which is what?
well, if you research a phenomenon in Japanese culture, it's called the grass eater men, which basically it's an entire generation of young men, mostly under 30, who have zero interest in relationships with women, no real ambition in life, don't even want girlfriends for the most part. Their economy is plummeting. Their population is aging. If trends continue the way they are, their infrastructure is going to continue to decay. And I think that is largely because young men in places like Japan are asleep. They know something's wrong. They don't know what. So they just turn to their video games, hanging out with their friends, reading comics, watching cartoons, and not giving a bloody hell what happens to the world around them. And I believe the vast majority of them, I've even read studies, that actually look at them as a cultural phenomenon. They're increasingly the norm.
Did you say that they're increasingly the norm? So this isn't a small number of men. This is a huge number of men.
It's a huge number of men, and it's almost all young men. And what most of the popular press, even in Japan, analyzes them as is very much like we've seen other places. Why it's these young men refusing to man up and take responsibility, and all of this patent shaming language, to which most of these young men are responding with a shrug of their shoulders and not caring. And that's a civilization on the decay. It's an economy on the decay. And I can see it eventually just collapsing into a sort of effete, withering, dying culture. Now, a dying culture can take centuries to die. Look at the Roman Empire, just for example. Nobody can tell you when exactly it ended. It just sort of petered out and extinguished itself. I think that's what Japan is looking at by the end of this century. The United States, Canada, the UK, most of Europe, I believe they're all going in that direction. I think the Japanese are perhaps 10 years ahead of us on that curve, but we're not far behind. And it's just continued dissolution of the family, continued social dysfunction caused by fatherhood, no long, being basically thrown out of the family, a dysfunctional culture that just gets slowly more dysfunctional all the time. That's one direction. The other is what I hope to see achieved is we wake up. Erin Pitsey has this wonderful question that she started asking. She even asked it at the International Conference on Men's Issues last month. She started asking men who've discovered these issues and really started looking at them. She says, "How long have you been awake?" And let's take the grass eaters an example in Japan. It appears, because we recently published a study by a Japanese academic who looked at them and what they fell into and, what they were like and how they lived their lives. One thing that they weren't was political, and one thing they weren't was even particularly culturally aware. Now, I contrast that with what we see growing in the English-speaking world at the moment, the men going their own way movement and the men's rights movement. These are men who are conscious of what's going on. And if you're conscious of what's going on and you're awake about what's going on, well, even if nobody has all the answers on how to fix it, the first step is identifying and saying, this is what's going on. This is why it's happening. And what is my response to it going to be? It's the difference between having a conscious response and an unconscious response. It's the difference between getting angry and punching somebody and getting angry and doing something productive with your anger. It's the difference between being depressed and not knowing why you're depressed, or knowing that you're depressed for a reason and constructing a plan to get yourself out of this, and so on and so forth. So I think the most important thing we can be doing is not just being awake ourselves, but getting more men awake, more young men especially. It's all very well and good for you and me, middle-aged men who've already had whatever children we're going to have and have our careers more or less where they are and aren't likely to change much. But, I've got a 17-year-old son, and I need to be talking about these issues with him, and I am, without force-feeding him, of course, because how much does a 17-year-old really listen to his old man anyway? But the point is that we need to get more men aware, because once enough people are aware of what's really happening and I can identify what's going on, then a badly needed cultural dialogue, which feminism purported to be starting but actually stopped from happening, can begin, which is, all right, the old social contract between men and women doesn't work anymore. And oh yes, by the way, 40 years ago, women had some complaints with some merits. They may here and there still have some complaints with merits, although in 2014 it's a bloody short list, if you ask me. But they're there. But men have to be an equal part of the conversation, and not with this gynocentric nonsense about how can men make women's lives better. No, it's time for women to start answering the question of what they can do to make men's lives better. And how can they change themselves and their behavior, and asking themselves, what do they owe men? Now, if the answer is nothing, that's fine, because men can respond by saying, fine, but then we owe you nothing either, cupcake. Or it could be, no, we can start on a path of, well, basically, I seem to recall a time in history where men and women actually liked each other. And I think if enough men and women come awake to the fact that men are human too, then we can start that necessary cultural dialogue. And I think that's most important. The cultural dialogue is what's most important, because you and I are old enough to realize that there have been people working on legislative change at the government level for decades. And they've either failed or they've succeeded in getting some improvements, only to see within a fairly short time, whatever reforms they instituted to make things better, the status quo found its way back to the same old gynocentric paradigm that, puts women's needs and interests first and makes males irrelevant. And so no change in law is going to last unless the culture itself is ready to sustain it.
Which requires huge power, huge ongoing power to change the culture. And it might not be possible because of the internet. It's very difficult. It's all right if you, if you have a captive audience and you can dictate to them what to think, if you like, because let's say you live in a country where the mainstream media dominate all the time, which is the kind of country that we grew up in, certainly I grew up in when I was young, where you had, very few voices. But with the internet, it's going to be very difficult to dominate, to foist any ideology or conversation or point of view onto the public, because you don't have that control over their minds anymore. So my point would be, how do you change a cultural diet? It requires vast numbers to participate willingly without disrupting the whole process, which is so easy to do on the internet.
I don't think it's quite as difficult as all that. Mind you, patience is key. I've met any number of men who've declared for example, the men's rights movement is doomed and can't possibly succeed because it just can't for various reasons. Although it all seems to boil down because they haven't seen any changes in the last year. From my perspective, if you look at movements for social change, and not all movements for social change succeed, but if you look at the ones that do succeed, very few were overnight successes, and some took centuries. When slavery, for example, was outlawed, that didn't. That required a broad cultural consensus that slavery was wrong. Actually, the British were a big part of that. At some point, it just became intolerable for there to even be a slave trade to the British. And most Americans forget this, but not only did you guys end slavery before we did, but then the British started blockading slave ships from getting to America. And but still, in America, it didn't end until there was a bloody civil war. But my point is, the move to end slavery took about 400 years from start to finish. I don't necessarily think what we're doing is going to take 400 years, but you have. Oh, it could. I personally, I'm ready for that. If I die having seen only incremental improvements, all right, I'll say I made incremental improvements. Harriet Tubman, who ran the Underground Railroad here in the United States to free slaves, said herself that in her lifetime she had freed 1,000 slaves, which she could have freed thousands of more if only she could have convinced them that they were slaves. Because many of them saw no other life or no other choice. But on the other hand, but I'm optimistic because I'll tell you what. Okay, I just mentioned a big one, which is slavery. But let's look at another movement for social change, gay rights. We're both old enough. I think you're a little older than me, not too much, but I think you're a little older than me. Okay, all right. I'm 48. We'll say you've got about. All right, 62. Okay, I'm 60, so you've got
62.
God, I can't even do math. I'm obviously not very bright. All right, you got about a decade and a half on me. All right, so you remember even better than I when it was socially unacceptable to even discuss that. And where if you heard a story about two young men caught buggering each other and they both got thrown in jail or had the crap beaten out of them, well, that wouldn't have seemed very unusual to you. Whatever your reaction would have been, it wouldn't have been shock, except shock that two young men were doing such horrid things. And that was the normal point of view.
But bear in mind that the media, once again, when I was young, my mind was controlled by the mainstream media, by the priests, by Christian thinking, and so there was no escape route really for one's own thoughts in a way. So the only point I'm making there is that it was very easy for the powers that be to tell people what their point of view was. It's not so easy anymore.
In the particular case of gays, I was always in defense of the rights of gay people to do their thing. It was nobody's bloody business. It just wasn't. And I was able to take that position in a time where it was not popular to take that position. That this is fundamentally, you aren't required to approve. What you're required to do as a decent person is to leave them the hell alone. And I don't think the media caused that change. I think grassroots change in the cultural attitudes changed.
There was rioting.
Well, rioting certainly was a part of it. The Stonewall riot here in these states was a part of that. Although, but the point is we saw a slow change, and I'm convinced that change didn't come because the media made it happen. I mean, to some extent, perhaps they did.
Well, remember that let me just say that a lot of gays at the time, they were in the media and in the theatre and, doing drama and things like that. So they did kind of, as the media grew in size, as opposed to just a few proprietors and what have you, they did manage to, uh, you know, they were already in those kind of areas in the professions. As I say, they were actors, actresses and what have you. So they did have a kind of power. They were on the inside of one section of the powers that be that did give them a bit more leverage, didn't it?
All right, that's fair enough. So perhaps the gay movement did benefit from some presence, from insider status as writers, actors, producers, what have you. Well, so now things are more, but I still think that in the final analysis, most people at gut instinct, once they realize that the gay fellow isn't going to rape you or try to molest your child, at root don't care that much. And if you look at what the men's movement is asking for the most part, with one or two exceptions that are a little contentious, like giving men some power over their own reproductive rights, for example, or treating female sexual predators a little more seriously, you look at what men's activists are asking for,
And it's not very much.
It's not only is it not very much, but it's things that you will usually find most people say, well, that's perfectly sensible and that's perfectly fair. What the feminists have managed to do through their control of the mainstream media, which they're losing, has to stop that. Yes, and to stop that very needed conversation from happening. And so I think if what you believe in and what you want to do is actually in tune with what most people do instinctively see as fair, then you are going to win eventually.
Eventually. So Dean, let me move on. What should MRAs be doing? Do you think that? Is there anything that MRAs are not doing that, in your view, they should be doing, or not doing enough of, or haven't thought of doing? Is there something more that MRAs themselves should be doing, and they're not getting their act together and doing it?
All right, there's two or three. One of them is a small thing. I've met any number of MRAs who think there are no groups doing actual political action. They should make themselves aware of the fact that isn't true and try to lend at least some support to those groups that are doing them.
And financial, if I may say so as well. Some of these groups could do with a few dollars.
Yes. Now, I don't know who to point to in the UK for that. I do know there are, in the United States, in every state, there is at least one group, if not more than one, working on legislative change on fathers' issues at minimum. And there's always the intactivist movement, which deserves our support whenever we can give it. So don't just assume that there are no political groups. They do exist. Look for them and give them some help, whatever it is. Hell, even an encouraging word is good. Some recognition, point to them. Here in the United States, Save Services does some work in Washington, D.C. Now, they don't call themselves a men's rights group. However, the work they are doing is all stuff that's on the MRA agenda, which is to stop, the number one of which is to stop allowing the use of false allegations in family court and to start treating all domestic violence victims, male or female, equally. That is a group that needs our support, whether they call themselves a men's group or not.
And what else? So
that's
recognizing
one. Yes.
Yes.
Recognizing them, find them, do a little research. They exist. Some of them will strongly resist the men's rights label because there's a stigma associated with it. But if they're working on men's issues, recognize them, support them, volunteer a little if you can, throw them a little money if you can. Okay, so there is that. I've met a surprising number who think there are no groups working politically on our issues, and they are. So some recognition there that it's happening. Do your research, give some people some support. Second thing, and this is a little bigger, stop fighting with your fellow men's advocates.
Oh, goodness, yes, absolutely. I
Stop
agree,
it.
totally.
If
Yes.
you don't see things their way,
Just ignore them.
that's right. Ignore them or do the even more mature thing if you can. Say, you know what? He may be right and I may be wrong. Let the best man win. I'm going to do it my way. He'll do it his way. And let's see who get, because in the broad analysis, fighting each other, so foolish, so foolish, so foolish. But the biggest thing of all, and this is the hardest thing to do, but I believe this is bigger than all of anything else you could do combined.
Yes.
Come out of the closet. If you can find a way to come out of the closet, come out. Because the more of us who do, the more of us who can. And
Yes.
that,
But we mustn't shame those at all who can't come out. And so I would say, even if you can't come out, you can still be active in the men's movement.
that's right. I have any number of men I've come across who I've worked with, who I know give us financial support or help arrange things behind the scenes for us, or even do politically active work that you will never hear about, but who are actually doing some very effective political work. They need to be secretive about what they're doing. But there's more of us than people think. And if you're in a position, even in government, but if you're in a position where you can say, yes, my name is Ian Dwyer, and I am from Leeds, and this is what I think, and I don't care if you don't like me for it, you will probably discover there are more people around you who think exactly the way you do, or close enough. And the more of us who do it, the safer it becomes. Because
And I think that if we ever get to a situation where it's normalized, then we've kind of won.
that's right.
There are a lot of supporters of the men's movement will actually deny that they're MRAs, and yet they spend a great deal of time engaged in MRA activism.
That's right. Because they actually are doing work toward equity and equality under the law. And for 98% of us, at least in my experience, that's what we're looking for: equity and equality before the law, equity and/or equality. Can't always have complete equality, but under the law. All right, obviously men can't have abortions, for example, but men can have a little more control over their own reproductive freedom. There should be a grand stigma associated with a woman getting pregnant by a man without asking him first. There should be a real stigma to that. That's an incredibly horrible, selfish thing to do to somebody. And you name the issues. If genital mutilation is not okay for girls, it's not okay for boys either. And so on and so forth. And
Okay,
so
well, yes. If I can move you on to AVFM in particular, because you're the managing editor there, what would you, let's say $500,000 came into your lap to do with, for AVFM, because one of our problems is we don't have enough money. We've got, we're up against, billions of dollars worth of funding every year to feminist ideology in one form or another. And we're functioning on a shoestring. I mean, it's close to zero in a way. But let's say $500,000 popped into AVFM's, pocket. What could be done with that money? What do you think could be done or should be done with that kind of increase in flexibility?
Yes, but it requires a careful answer. If a $500,000 check appears, and of course doesn't bounce, so we actually cash it. I have a $500,000 to play with. I would start, with AVFM in particular, immediately looking into how to use that money to create revenue streams. See, because
to make more money.
Somebody hearing that might initially think, oh, so it's all about making money. So you can burn through $500,000 easily in a year and have very little left to show for it. What the men's movement needs, I mean, and what AVFM needs, but not just us, but AVFM certainly, we need to be able to sustain. We have an astonishing group of volunteers who are working for either nothing at all, or if you looked at what they do get paid versus the hours they put in, they're probably working on pennies on the dollar. They're doing it for love. They're doing it because they believe not in Paul Elam, not in me, not in Karen Strawn, but in the mission, the goals, sustainable revenue streams, so that I can say, well, we have an annual operating budget, whether it's $50,000 a year or $1 million a year. Now I can start hiring people to do full-time advocacy work. I can beef up our radio operations so that they really are running all-day programming. So that when we do activism work, and we do, I'm shocked how many people think AVFM does no activism. Yes, we do. We take on individual cases usually and try to shame cops, prosecutors, judges, and expose them, which is an enormous amount of work. And I could be doing more of it. We could be doing more of it. If I could quit my day job, and I do have one, I could quadruple my own productivity. And I don't require a lot to live on. I really don't. But I do have child support payments to make and rent and all that business. So I would immediately invest it in vehicles that would allow us to get revenue streams so that we can have full-time activists. I mean, I'll give you one example. We had the International Men's Conference, and here in Oakland County, Michigan, which is where I live, there's one group, and I'm going to be writing an expose on them, that offers domestic violence and rape crisis services to women. Mm-hmm. Now, titularly, they say they help both women and men, but it's a bloody lie. They have a token man or two, and 99% of their stuff goes into helping women. And they're openly feminist, and they're openly feminist indoctrinated. This is in one county in one state of the United States, and it's only one of the services in that state. Now, they made a serious effort to try to get our conference shut down. They have a $4 million a year operations budget, and $500,000 a year just earmarked for activism work. And so, of course, they use some of that $500,000 a year activism budget to try to get the international conference on men's issues shut down. That's serious resources. Now, they failed, but the point is, this points to how big the feminist empire is. This is one organization of several in one county in one state of the United States. If I had just their budget, I believe I could change the world. Because we're on the right of it on most of the issues. We just are. We're on the right of issues that most people agree with. Which is why their strategy for decades now has been to shut us up with shame, with sliming, with whatever they can do. And if they can be confronted, they can be taken down or forced to change. I mean, forced to change, whether they like it or not. So yeah, with money would come the efforts to be running a 24/7 operation, so that we had people doing things all the time. Although AVFM's main mission is always going to be sort of, at least I believe it will be. It will always be to be a sort of hub where people can come to get information about the movement, get news about the movement, learn about the issues, and then hopefully over time, more and more local groups will start doing activism where they are, because we can't be all things to all men, and we're not, and we're never going to be. But if we can be the centralized hub where people look to first to learn about these issues, stop being afraid to talk about these issues, to wake up, to make the culture wake up, then we could be doing a lot more. But we're going to get there one way or the other. So yeah, anyway, the short answer is you give me $500,000, I'll be using that to immediately find a way to create ongoing revenue streams so I can employ more people and more resources sustainably. So that we...
Where will the revenue come from? How will I can understand you using it for employing, getting more people on the job. But where would the stream come from? Where's the money come? I can see your outgoings, but I can't see your incoming right now.
Well, all of our income, 100% of it is donations. And
no, but I mean, yes. So if you've got the $500,000, when you say use it to bring in revenue streams, apart from employing people, which doesn't bring in money, how would we bring in money? If you see what I mean.
Well, I would. One of the things I would probably do immediately is hire somebody whose expertise is in setting up and running operations like this. I mean, I've been in conversations with a few people over the last year who run organizations, some of which are nonprofit, some of which are profit, but are still ultimately, based on wildlife conservation or some other semi-political social issue. And they have expertise in that. I mean, the fact of the matter is Paul and I have Paul Elam, me, James Huff, any of these other people, we have no expertise in that. How do you market to the point where you're reaching a larger audience who wants to either buy T-shirts and mugs or whatever it takes, or just give money?
Oh, well, shall I give you my opinion on this?
Surely, because I don't know shit about it. I'm a writer and editor and a rabble-rouser. That's what I'm good at.
I don't really have any doubts about this. What I would do is use the money to create operations to shake down big empires. In other words, I would say to a newspaper here in the UK, something like the Daily Mail or something, we're going to continually attack you for anything and everything, and we're not going to stop. We're going to undermine your newspaper until you cough up and support us. I would do exactly what the feminists did. I would do the same to politicians. I would say, I'm going to undermine your party. I'm going to undermine the person, and until you pay up or do something to help us, perhaps give us publicity, even if it isn't money. I would say either you give us some positive publicity, or we'll just keep attacking you and undermine your stream revenue. And because these groups have got a lot of money, they have a lot to lose. I would start attacking their advertisers and so on. And that's exactly what the feminists did. And that's how they got their power. I would do the same.
Oh, absolutely. It's all a matter of looking at who's got the money and power and making them one way or the other afraid they're going to lose it if they don't play ball with you. Because in the final analysis, if most people agree with you, but there's no impetus no effort to make the change happen, then the change won't happen. The status quo will remain. So that's the one thing that stinks about men's advocacy is most of our constituency, once they figure out that there's a problem once they've already been financially ruined.
Yes, I know, and it's too late for them. Dean, where was it? Look, it's been I don't want this interview to go on too long because otherwise I'll bore you and maybe our listeners. And I don't know how long we've been going, but about an hour.
I think so. But it's been a distinct pleasure and honor talking to you, Harry.
And Dean, I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
All right. Have a good one, Harry.